Welcome back to the most fabulous podcast in the world. We have a poet today, and to see if our candles burn at both ends throughout the night.
So I'm sure some of our listeners will know who it is already.
Most likely just off of that one line. Edna St. Vincent Millay was born in Rockland, Maine in February of 1892 to a nurse mother and a school teacher. And her middle name comes from a hospital where her uncle's life was saved not long before her birth.
I've never actually wondered where her middle name came from, but now that I know, it makes so much sense.
Yeah, Saint Vincent is not a typical name even for a boy, let alone a girl. However, her parents did not stay together long. After having two more daughters, they split. Her mother took the children and stayed with relatives for a time. She was frequently away working, but this didn't have too negative of an effect on Millay and her sisters.
So they had other adults looking after them, or it was just a really safe area, or what?
They did have other adults looking after them, but their relationship with their mother didn't suffer too much from her being absent frequently for work.
Hmm. Well, that's good.
By 5, Millay learned to read via poetry, which seems very
Ooh, it's
fitting.
like being raised by wolves. She has it in her.
This soon extended to music.
Although we don't hear about her as a musician.
No, we do not. She was bit by the verse bug instead. Her father wrote, promising to visit, but he never did. His letters then remained the same throughout the years. And then the divorce
Hmm.
finally cleared in 1901 when Millay was 9. The fact her father basically disappeared physically from her life after that had somewhat of a negative impact, as you could imagine. And he never actually sent the $5 he was supposed to for his daughters for their upkeep.
$5. I mean, I know that was different in money then, but still, $5. Like, come on, dude. Doesn't sound like a great guy.
Another impact of this time is her mother's fairy tales. She would change any unpleasant ending into a happy one, something her daughter would do again and again in her own writing.
I used to make my parents do that when I was a kid. Fun fact. I can totally see this happening. It's little kids like things to be happy. So endearing, though. I love to see how this evolves as she gets older.
The family eventually settled into a house in Camden, Maine, and there Millay started school. As she frequently went by the name Vincent, there was trouble at school. One male teacher would call her any girl's name that started with a V, but not Vincent. She'd always respond by saying, "Yes, Mr. Wilbur, but my name is Vincent." He eventually threw a book at her and said that she'd run the school long enough.
Oof.
This led to her mother storming down to the office. The teacher ignored her, shut the door, and basically pushed her down the stairs.
Excuse me? That is a bit harsh.
Thankfully, the superintendent agreed with her mother that Millay should transfer to the next nearest school. Her mother then ensured that she was a year ahead at the new high school.
And the teacher didn't get fired? Like, so teachers are just allowed to push students downstairs?
It was her mother that was pushed down the stairs. The locals in this area did not necessarily like them. The Malay matriarch tended to boast about Vincent and not let anyone else get a word in edgewise.
I love this. I love her mother. Also, so we should just say, since she's going by the name Vincent, from what I understand, she was not otherwise like transmasculine or anything, right? This is a name that she likes to have, but she still likes to be seen as a girl and woman.
Correct, there is nothing trans about Malay. She just liked her middle name better than her first name.
Mm-hmm. Always good to clear up because, as we look at historical people, it's sometimes not in the record as clearly what their gender identity might have been. But luckily, with people who write things down, we get more of a sense than say uh, musicians or dancers or things like that.
By now, Millay is also writing and submitting her work to magazines. Her mother actually sent one of her poems to the St. Nicholas League. which was a monthly children's illustrated magazine, and Vincent won a gold medal for it at 14.
Wow. So she is getting a head start.
It was also then published in the Current Literature in New York.
Wow. Published at 14.
By 16, she felt she had found her vocation as a poet and continued writing, though not always published. This also led to the editorship of the school paper during her senior year. During the summer, she began writing her most ambitious poem to date, and she also participated in drama projects. This led after school to winning the lead role in Willowdale, the production in October of a traveling theater company.
Huh. So she is doing things other than writing.
However, like all artist types, she could be eccentric. She created an imaginary man and a nightly ritual around him, starting in 1911 when she was 19. She called it her consecration, and it occurred on the 3rd of every month for 2 years. The ritual part involved lighting a candle, kissing a tin ring, and having imaginary conversations that she recorded in the back of her diary.
I love this. I wish I could have met her. This sounds so cool. And honestly, as a practitioner of a religion, can I just say I'm getting similar vibes. I can see why she would be doing something like that. It was probably very calming.
Yes, and this probably was partly due to being unsure of herself in real life, which tended to involve her taking a superior tone to hide that fact. When a man who was no more to her than a pen pal apologized for owing her a letter, she reprimanded him sharply. Dear delinquent, you don't deserve so amiable a correspondent as I. You are not worthy even to wield my pen wiper. But you made a very nice apology, and moreover, you groveled gracefully. Basically, there's a lot of teenage angst and drama over dating because while the consecration part, it was easy to deal with the imaginary man, real life teenage boys were a problem.
Yeah, no. I think anyone who has been a teenager can relate.
We move into 1912. The phone rang. She couldn't quite make out what it said, but eventually she heard that her father was seriously ill. It was decided that Vincent would make the train trip to see him. It was the first time they'd seen each other in years. When she arrived, the nurse met her in the downstairs part of the house. Millay said, "It didn't seem to me that the man on the bed was my father, but I went over and stood beside him. He opened his eyes and cried, 'Vincent, my little girl.' They hugged, but as he had difficulty keeping his eyes open, she was convinced he was going to die.
Well, at least he was calling her Vincent.
Yes, but he also did not, in fact, die. The doctor hadn't expected him to live on March 1st, but by March 4th he rallied, and Vincent was writing home about it. She stayed with him for a while, but she also went out dancing with the local boys in his town. They got on fairly well, probably because her father was a very charming man, even if he wasn't necessarily the best father most of the time.
Yeah.
She only returned when her mother enticed her with the prospect of submitting her poems into a $1,000 prize contest. For reference, this is about $29,000 in today's money. In response, she raced home.
Yeah, I don't think there's many people who wouldn't.
In less than 2 months, she finished her poem, Renaissance, and sent it in.
Yeah, this is a really good poem. It's very long, and has a lot in it, but it's so beautiful. And I just think that anyone who is going through a time should read this poem because it's got everything, and it's so hard to believe that she was like basically a child when she wrote this because it's got so much.
Her mother didn't mention that she also submitted her own poems and was her daughter's competition.
Ooh.
Vincent won out of 100 submissions, though the letter referred to her as E. Vincent Millay, Esquire. She still went frequently by her middle name, and it still confused people easily. So her acceptance letter included an explanation of how she always put her first name as an initial. This led to an extended correspondence with the editor, And later she recited part of the poem at a party at the hotel in town where her sister Norma worked as a waitress. It stunned a woman in the audience named Caroline Dow, and she set Vincent on the path to college, something heretofore out of reach for the girl in the middle of rural Maine. Meanwhile, she was getting writing advice from that editor still. She also flirted with him a bit, which disturbed his wife, but it helped her.
Yeah. Lessons that you learn as a female creative.
Combined with Dow, all this set her on the path to become America's beloved poet and to move her from rural Maine to New York City. But now, Millay is going to college. There was a bit of back and forth over whether it would be Smith College or Vassar College. She entered Vassar in the end at the age of 21 in 1913, but first she spent some time at Barnard College in New York City. This was to prepare her for the rigor of Vassar coursework, hence the two English classes, one French and one Latin, that she enrolled in. Her entrance exams to Barnard were also waived. She was, as she put it, a very, very irregular special.
Yeah. No, I haven't heard of this happening before. It's a cool idea, though.
All expenses were basically taken care of by Miss Dow. No student loans or personal loans for Millay.
We should all be so lucky.
Very true, even networking was taken care of, with Dow taking her round to different people. Millay was also still sending poems to different magazines for publication, which netted her a small amount of money.
So she's doing pretty well for herself.
Of course, she still had to pass Vassar's entrance exams, but she did that, as we mentioned earlier, and was off. Her Bernard courses didn't transfer as she never actually matriculated there, though. Now, while Vincent could be blasé calling it only a college, she actually viewed it as a lifeline. What other way was there to truly get out of rural Maine, especially after a taste of New York City?
Right, as a lot of people even today will talk about, college isn't just teach you how to do certain things. It is put you among the milieu that will allow you to carry on doing things and helping you to learn how to network and interact with people in the spheres you want to go into.
Hence, this podcast was born. In addition to academics, there was drama and flirting. There was a Halloween ball, and because no men were allowed, this was, after all, still a women's college. Vassar didn't go co ed for several decades after this. Half the girls had to dress as boys. Millay wrote, "Lucky I'm little and have to be a girl."
Hmm.
Of course, there were crushes now. Margaret, who was not as lucky and got to be Jack for a night, and Catherine Philine, also not as lucky as Millay.
Oh no, did they have to dance together? Mm.
Well, obviously, it was a Halloween ball.
Yeah, well, tragic having to dance with women dressed as men. We all know how difficult that can be.
There was a bit of a love triangle at one point between Vincent and two different Catherines. So there was Catherine Feline and Catherine Tilt. Catherine T has a darling room on the third floor. The stairs begin right at Catherine Feline's door, so she's pretty likely to know when I go up there. If she sees me in the hall, she watches to see if I turn towards my room or towards the stairs. One night I came along in my blanket bathrobe with some books in my arms and started down the hall. "Ho ho," said Catherine Feline. "Where are you going?" "Where do you suppose?" said I, and tramped upstairs. You see, it bothers her. Sometimes she comes up when I'm up there, knows I'm up there, and says, "Oh, I beg your pardon. Perhaps I interrupt, you two turtle doves." And there you are.
Yeah, sounds like a tense situation.
The holidays put an end to it. This pattern of provoking jealousy or push pull continued into her sophomore year with Elaine Raleigh, a hockey player the year above her. They were good enough friends by Thanksgiving for Millay to accompany her to Elaine's parents for the holiday, but this also would not end well. Elaine liked her a lot, and while Millay didn't want to drop her, she did want to step back from the intensity. She took to flirting with other girls. As one classmate said, Millay was a seductress. Oh, I should think so. You have only to look at those poems. I see nothing wrong with that in her. She drew people to her. Also, keep in mind, Millay was 3 to 4 years older than all the other girls in her year. She was also 2 years older than Elaine, despite being in the year below her.
So I'm sensing that she's kind of a Natalie type here.
You could say that, though she never wrote out all of her affairs in Légions, Demi-Légions, and Aventures lists.
Right. But in terms of maybe being polyamorous and not always caring about people's feelings in the beginning.
I would say she's a bit of a butterfly. By her senior year, she was writing the hymn to be sung for her commencement and for the rest of the class of 1917, but she never heard it. You see, she was invited to an opera in New York City that spring and broke a rule to go see it. Then she was forbidden from leaving campus as a result. But she was also invited on a trip, which she took. She was suspended indefinitely as a result, which cost her her degree.
This is so weird, can I just say? This is a women's college. This isn't like a boarding school or something. This is a college.
Keep in mind there were a lot more rules, probably even more so at women's colleges at the time.
This is just a different time. Maybe she wasn't always following all the rules.
Oh, she was not. She had been breaking rules during her entire time at college. So this was the straw that broke the camel's back.
Gotcha.
Not even her class's petition to have her walk with them broke the Vassar president's resolve. So Millay left for New York City. She planned to go on the stage. Thankfully, she knew the actress Edith Wynne Matheson, who she also had a fling with, but it was the Provincetown Players that she worked with while establishing herself as a poet. The writer Juna Barnes was also a member, but the two did not get along. She once wrote to her sister Norma to not show anyone, especially Barnes, a play she'd written. They would hate it and make fun of it, and old Juna Barnes would rag you about it, hoping it would get to me. This tension would continue in later years when Barnes' lover, Thelma Wood, would chase after Millay in Paris in the 1920s.
Oof. So, a long standing grudge then.
She then met Floyd Dell, a divorced 30-year-old apostle of the shocking new psychoanalysis.
Hmm.
They started an affair. He wanted to marry her. She deflected.
Sounds about right.
Now, the US entered World War I, and there were protests over it. In April 1918, Floyd Dell and a few other men were tried for obstructing military recruiting efforts, which was newly illegal under the Espionage Act passed by Congress for the war. While they walked free after 9 days, they weren't actually acquitted, but also by this time Millay's interest was waning. While she did throw a going away dinner when he was suddenly drafted, she quickly moved on. While he was also quickly honorably discharged due to not being acquitted yet, and therefore ineligible to actually be in the military, he returned to find her with someone else, Walter Roberts.
I mean, we have heard nothing about this guy to particularly recommend him, but that is kind of a shitty thing to do.
Now, she didn't love Roberts, but she liked his devotion to her poetry. She began contributing to his magazines at 50 cents a line, which is about $10.17 in today's money.
Oh, that's pretty decent.
Yeah, that's way above minimum wage.
I guess depending on how long her poems are, if she's doing haikus, then forget about it.
Yeah, but say 10 lines to a poem, that's over $100.
Yeah.
He encouraged her also to write fiction when she mentioned an interest in it. She then published said fiction under the name Nancy Boyd, and thankfully, fiction paid more and solved her financial budgeting.
Can I just say sentences no one has ever said before? Fiction paid more.
Yes, take that myth of the starving writer. In the meantime, World War I ended. It didn't have much of an effect on her, as we've seen. 1919 saw her writing an anti war play and having an affair with a married man.
So she had the war had some effect on her.
Just a tiny bit.
So the married man.
Just one of her many, many flings, and it seems like this one ended the one with Roberts. Millay, again, very much a butterfly flitting from flower to flower. And one affair here led to pregnancy, which led to considering marriage, then instead deciding to meet her mother in England to induce an abortion, which may have led to her being ill at times over the next few years.
Oof. Yeah, because abortion technology was not great due to it being illegal in a lot of places and very stigmatized.
On the writing front, she was just as busy. Between 1917 and 1920, she published 77 poems, a play, and at least one book.
Wow.
Then she got the chance to go to Europe. She left New York at the beginning of 1921, and she was now writing for Vanity Fair in Paris. Then she went to Rome, where she met the American ambassador, who suggested an adventure in Albania. From there, she then headed for Vienna before heading back to Paris. However, she was disappointed with how things were progressing in life, both writing and her love life. The men frequently sulked and reacted badly to her dropping them.
No, really.
Things turned around in 1923 in the US, though. She met Eugene Boissevin through Floyd Dell, and then Columbia University informed her that she was nominated for the Pulitzer Poetry Prize.
Wow. So whatever she's doing now, she's doing it right.
Though this was overshadowed by having to have her abdomen x rayed. The two actually married right before she went into the hospital for surgery before her appendix would explode. She said if she died then, that she'd be famous forever. She didn't die. She won the Pulitzer Prize instead.
Yeah. So a flawed premise there.
Now, Eugene was apparently very much her type. As some people said, he was rather the motherly type, which fits with taking care of her after she got out of the hospital. 'Twas also not a monogamous relationship.
So he was actually cool with her being a butterfly.
This followed a speaking tour and a trip to the Far East before going back to Paris.
Now, do we have any stories from the travels? Because we have, she hits these points on the map, but does she bring back experiences? Does it affect her in any way?
Well, in the case of Paris, dealing with Juna Barnes being upset with you because her girlfriend is chasing after you drunkenly through the cafes is probably an experience.
Yeah, no, something to write home about.
She has letters she writes to people about hiking in Japan and seeing waterfalls and visiting Buddhist shrines.
Do we know if this affects her writing at all, or is this just kind of a good experience?
Do not all experiences affect a creative's work?
Fair enough. I mean, maybe it wasn't like a tangible, I went to Japan and then I wrote a book about Japan. Maybe it's, you know, I went to Japan and I myself changed and then my writing changed. I see that.
This time also came with a refashioning of her image. She would write in the countryside, dress better, and no longer swear like a sailor.
I love that she's been swearing like a sailor this whole time. I did not know this about her.
The writing now was not only poetry, she continued with plays and fiction, the latter under pseudonym forever.
Was this writing in a different style than her previous writing to go along with her new image?
It didn't change dramatically.
So it was more about her brand.
Yes, very much her brand. Money does need to come in after all. They bought Steepletop, a 635-acre former blueberry farm in New York in 1925,
To do what with?
to live there.
And like farm blueberries or
Millay never became a farmer, no. It was just the being away from people.
yeah, you do see a lot of creatives get there.
That's always the goal. Buy acres and acres of land and sequester yourself. Be the eccentric in the woods you would love to meet.
So what else is going on for her at this time?
Her libretto, The King's Henchman, was put on in 1927 at the Metropolitan Opera House.
Ooh,
It drew on a previous account of Edgar, the King of Wessex, in 960 CE. The only worry that day was earlier when a friend of a friend opened a box that had a note stating not to open it and found nude photos of her, her husband, and another couple.
And he couldn't have just kinda let that box stay closed?
And no, this woman did not let it stay closed. These photos were later recovered and burned, but there was also a bit of an argument of why didn't you lock it away versus why did you ignore the note and look at it? Moral of the story, always abide by notes from friends of friends. So basically, public scandal was avoided, private scandal, not so much.
If you're gonna snoop, keep it to yourself.
Other endeavors, now that she has fame and money, include wading into political activism. So, two Italian immigrants were accused of murdering a shoe factory paymaster. You might know it as the Sacco and Vanzetti case, but they were tried, found guilty, and sentenced to death in April 1927, despite many appeals. The judge was believed to be biased as he was overheard to say, "Did you see what I did with those anarchist bastards the other day?"
Yeah, so this was part of this larger, thing of, well, if a person isn't a WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and they're a new immigrant, they must be an anarchist who wants to destroy the government. And a lot of people were like, "No, they're just Italian."
Millay joined the picket line at the State House in Boston, protesting with hundreds of people in August. The day before the execution, she actually got an interview with the governor about it. Her appeal included info of a wrongful conviction in Maine that was discovered to be wrong after the man was hanged.
And so you'd think that she would add a lot of weight to this appeal.
The governor didn't listen to her. The two men were executed the next day to worldwide outrage, which Millay gave vent to in verse.
Do we have a section of that poem that we could read?
Let us abandon then our gardens and go home, and sit in the sitting room. Shall the larkspur blossom or the corn grow under this cloud? Sour to the fruitful seed is the cold earth under this cloud. Fostering quack and weed we have marched upon but cannot conquer. We have bent the blades of our hoes against the stalks of them. Let us go home and sit in the sitting room. Not in our day shall the cloud go over and the sun rise as before. Forlorn, forlorn, stands the blue hayrack by the empty mow. We shall die in darkness and be buried in the rain. Evil does overwhelm the larkspur and the corn. We have seen them go under. Then her mother died in 1931,
Oof, one thing on top of another.
and that was a blow. They'd been close throughout the years, and then they had to dynamite through the main rock to bury her in the middle of winter. Funeral was followed by fleeing to New York and drinking into oblivion.
Yeah, understandably.
It took some time, but the grief did fade. The rest of the year saw the publication of a book, Fatal Interview, to 50,000 copies or more, and The King's Henchman became the most successful American opera ever held at the Met. She was now a celebrity, on the scale of F. Scott Fitzgerald, her contemporary, and it said she gave the jazz age its lyrical voice, as he became its prose chronicler. The downside was the press portraying her as a fragile child, the girl poet, when she did not ever want to become such a human.
Yeah, I don't get fragile from, the things that we've learned of her so far.
1932 saw her back in Paris as Natalie Barney dedicated an afternoon at her salon to Millet, a celebration and spotlighting Barney did to several women over the course of her salon hosting.
Did they know each other before this?
They had run in similar circles and possibly had met on previous trips.
Because she'd been in Paris, we just don't have, like, a big connection between the 2.
Millet was not really looking forward to it. She wrote, "It's going to be awful with such a noisy crowd." On the other hand, she wrote, "Miss Barney is charming, though, a great friend of Madame de la Rue Madrousse, a great and famous lesbian in her own right, and formerly a great and devoted friend of Remy de Gourmont, to whom he wrote his letters to an Amazon."
So, she likes the creatives involved, but not the idea of the crowds.
Correct, but the poetry reading still went over well, and she was at the height of her earning power, too. And with a love of races, she bought a Maryland horse farm that produced race horses, though Most of the time, she was only the major shareholder and not the sole owner. A downside, though, she was drinking way too much by 1933. After Vincent gave a reading at Bryn Mawr College, she got roaring drunk, but it was a cold sort of drunk, not the loud attention grabbing sort, until she went into one woman's room, undid her own evening dress, and stood there naked.
Uh, Vincent, that's not a cool thing to do.
Said woman helped her back to her own bed to try and sober up by morning. So no
Oh,
drunken tumble like she intended.
yeah, no, sounds like the best thing.
A trip to France led to abstaining from drink before there was Paris and cocktails. Likewise, 1936 was not a good year. She got into a car crash. During this, she injured her right shoulder and was given morphine for the pain, and she got hooked on it.
You know, a familiar story even today.
Now, heading into World War II, she did an about face from her pacifist stance in the previous World War. She now advocated for the US to join. She even joined radio broadcasts talking about it.
Did she say what made these two wars different in her mind?
She was very anti-fascist.
That'd do it.
Meanwhile, she still had her medical stuff. She had constant headaches and back pain, in addition to now entering menopause, that oh so fun period of hot flashes, irritation, and unstable moods, made even worse by morphine addiction, as it too can cause sweats, constipation, and flushing.
Love it. So it's just symptoms on top of symptoms.
Hospitalizations don't do much good, and no cause is ever given for her pain. It probably relates to the car accident, though. At one point, she was given estrogen to deal with the menopause to help with her moods. Note, no one knows the effect of mixing estrogen with morphine, but it certainly didn't make Millay serene.
Yeah, no, estrogen can help with menopause, but it's also, as with any medication, depends on the individual person and their individual body. So it's one of those things that you have to monitor and continually adjust.
To add to this, she was losing all her money with the racehorses.
No.
By 1940, she had to sell her stake in the farm. She and Eugene were also now in debt. Even worse, her reputation as a poet was declining, along with her getting older.
How can that happen? I mean, she's Edna St. Vincent Millay.
Many of her books are not selling well, their royalties are dwindling, and some books are going out of print.
And I guess she's not doing a lot of new creative output, what with all of her medical problems.
Correct, and the whole going into people's rooms, stripping yourself naked while drunk, that doesn't help.
Yeah, no, no.
Also, alcohol and drugs don't bode well for health and beauty, more so for a woman used to having flings and being seductive. So you can combine a mental toll with the health issues and the not bringing in enough money from writing. Add in a falling out with her younger sister, who felt that Vincent's fame and success undermined her own by placing her in her older sister's shadow. Said sister, Kathleen, then died in 1943, which did not help Millay mentally either.
Yeah, no, the guilt on top of everything.
So Millay is not doing well and is now retreating to Steepletop and becoming a recluse. World War II ended, but she's deep in a morphine addiction that led to hospitalization and then orders to avoid all drugs and alcohol. She also can't write. She had such trouble that she was terrified she'd never write again. Another round of detox followed in 1946. She manages to conquer the addiction, and then her husband fell ill. He went to the hospital in 1949 for lung cancer, had an operation, and then died of a stroke a few days later at the age of 69. She fell apart after this.
Understandably.
Remember, he basically took care of her, nursed her through illness and addiction. What the hell is she going to do now? Especially as a reclusive who rarely saw anyone else except for him?
Yeah, so what does she do?
She tries to get on. And then on October 19th, 1950, the man who hauled her wood in for the house found her at the bottom of the stairs with her head at a wrong angle and herself reeking of alcohol. She died from her neck breaking in the fall, which the coroner said was caused by a heart attack, and she was only 58 years old.
Wow. That is so rough.
Millay, in her time, was called the greatest woman poet since Sappho by many journalists. Since then, she has become embedded in pop culture. I'm sure you've heard, "My candle burns at both ends, it will not last the night. But ah, my foes and oh, my friends, it gives a lovely light." Well, her candle certainly burned at both ends, and she did not last the night.
At least she had some self-awareness.
Her work has since influenced and inspired numerous pieces of drama and music, including 1970s TV show characters, and then several plays and musicals. Unlike at the end of World War II, today you will find many of her books in print.
So, unlike a lot of her female contemporaries, she actually was remembered by the popular culture after she died.
Yes, though today many people will focus on her love life rather than on her poetry or anything else.
Mhm. I'm sure if you go to poetryfoundation.org, they'll have all of her stuff ready to be read.
Thank you for listening. Follow us on Twitter, subscribe, and remember, if it says don't open the box, don't open the box.